Good evening. My name is Phillip Munoz. I'm an associate professor here in political science and at the law school, and I am the director of the Tocqueville program for inquiry on religion and public life, and we're one of the sponsors of tonight's event. Thank you very much for coming. Just want to make sure, can those in the back hear me okay? Yeah. Thank you very much. And sorry, our AV, are we okay? Yep. Thank you very much. My role here is simply to welcome you and to start off with a few announcements, and then to introduce our Tocqueville fellow, Michael Bradley, who's going to be the host for the evening. For those of you who are here on campus, it's actually a busy week for the Tocqueville program. On Thursday, March 20th at 12:30, is our next event. We're having George Weigel. It's a name that's probably familiar to many of you. He's the best-selling author of Witness to Hope, the authoritative biography of John Paul II, a leading Catholic intellectual. He's going to be here on campus on Thursday, and he's giving a talk at 12:30. He'll be in the law school. The title of George's talk is Catholics in an Unfamiliar America. So that's this Thursday at 12:30. Please join us for that as well. On Friday, at the end of the week, the Tocqueville program will resume our Professors for Lunch series. Our topic this Friday is, what does it mean to be a Catholic university? I think that's an important topic around here. So join us for lunch, and we have three star faculty on a panel. Father Sean McGraw, I'm sure many of you know Father Sean, Professor Deneen, Patrick Deneen, who's here with us tonight, and then Tim O'Malley from theology. So that will be this Friday at noon in the Oak Room in South Dining Hall, and for those of you without meal cards, there's a complimentary lunch. One other announcement. At the Tocqueville program, we started a new fellowship program. It's called the Tocqueville Fellows. The Fellows, this is the first year of the Tocqueville Fellows. It's for undergraduates here at Notre Dame. Any undergraduate who's interested can apply. And our Tocqueville Fellows meet with our visiting speakers. They host their own events. The Fellows will be having breakfast with George Weigel on Thursday morning, for example. And one of our fellows, Michael Bradley, is our host for tonight's event. This event was his idea, and we at the Tocqueville program try to make these events possible. And our fellows are one of the ways our undergraduates here at Notre Dame can take leadership of the program, leadership here of the intellectual life at Notre Dame. It's been a thrill to work with Michael. Lots of energy, as I'm sure most of you know. He's the editor-in-chief of the Rover, the independent campus newspaper. He is a senior, a philosophy and theology major, and he's the reason we're here tonight. So let me call Michael to the stage, and thank you again for coming.
Good evening, everyone. I want to thank Professor Munoz for that introduction. I'd like to welcome all of you here, especially our visitors from off campus. As you know, we're contending with a rather popular holiday here in South Bend for your attention this evening. So in a special way, thanks for making time to be with us here on St. Patrick's Day. The title of tonight's discussion is Marriage, the Church, and the Common Good, Philosophical, Pastoral, and Social Reflections. As many of you know, perhaps no issue or issues are gripping the nation as firmly as are the questions that comprise what can be called the marriage debate. And this evening, we've brought together 4 Catholic scholars to discuss those questions in harmony with Catholic teaching. So before I introduce our panelists tonight, I'd like to say a few words in acknowledgement of our sponsors, our many sponsors, without whose generosity tonight would just not be possible. So I'd like to begin by thanking, of course, the Tocqueville program under the leadership of Professor Munoz. They've just been, of course, instrumental and essential to hosting this evening, or this event here this evening. I'd also like to thank Notre Dame's Institute for Church Life under the leadership of Professor John Cavadini, Notre Dame's Gender Relations Center under the leadership of Christine Karen Gebhardt, Notre Dame's Center for Ethics and Culture under the leadership of Professor Carter Sneed. We also have a couple of student groups in addition to the Irish Rover who are sponsoring this evening's event. Rodzinka under the leadership of my fellow senior Tim Kirchhoff, and the Orestes Brownson Council, also under the leadership of a fellow senior Alfredo Guzman Dominguez. Both of them are here, so thank you both for your help. And finally, we have a couple of off-campus groups who are supporting tonight's event. The Sycamore Trust, under the leadership of Bill Dempsey, who's an alumnus of the university, as well as Ethica Politica, under the leadership of Andrew Haynes. So our sponsors have been very generous, and thank all of you who are here especially for your help. And lastly, but most importantly, I want to thank Jen Smith, who is up here with her son. Jen has just been absolutely instrumental to making this evening happen. She has worked with me and fielded thousands and thousands of emails from me concerning logistics and other things, and has just been exceedingly gracious and patient with me. So Jen, thank you so much. You are the reason really that we're here tonight, that everything came together. Our format this evening, each of our panelists will speak for about 15 minutes or so, and then after our panel has concluded, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. And we'll hope to wrap up by about 8:45, by about 9 o'clock, to give you time to go out, enjoy the holiday. Responsibly. So here to my immediate right is Ron Belgau. Ron is a graduate student in philosophy at St. Louis University, where he teaches undergraduate courses in ethics and medical ethics, among other subjects. Ron has, as many of you know, written and spoken widely on marriage from a pastoral intellectual perspective, marriage and related questions. He also co-founded recently the online forum Spiritual Friendship, which is a site in which people can explore the Christian teaching on friendship as a means to helping them make sense of the Church's orthodox teachings on homosexuality. So, please welcome Ron. And I'm going to be keeping the introductions brief. You can look up these folks' resumes if you'd like afterwards. But Sharif Girgis is next to Ron's right. Sharif graduated from Princeton University before going on to study at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. He's currently enrolled in the JD program at Yale and the PhD program in philosophy at Princeton. Sharif co-authored along with Ryan Anderson and Princeton's Robert George the book What is Marriage? Man and Woman, a Defense. So please welcome Sharif as well. To Sharif's right is Ryan T. Anderson. Ryan is a William E. Simon Fellow in Religion and a Free Society at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. Ryan also graduated as an undergraduate from Princeton and is currently a doctoral candidate in political science here at the University of Notre Dame. He co-authored What is Marriage with Girgis and Robert P. George, and he's also the editor of Public Discourse, the Witherspoon Institute's online journal. Ryan T. Anderson. And to my far right, we have Dr. Jennifer Roback Morse. Dr. Morse earned her PhD in economics from the University of Rochester. She went on to teach at Yale University and at George Mason before founding the Ruth Institute, and she's currently the president of the Ruth Institute, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting lifelong married love between husband and wife. So, after I'm done, we'll thank Dr. Morse for being here as well. I'll have a seat and hand the microphone over to Ron, and we'll get going. So once again, please join me in thanking all of our panelists this evening.
Okay, I'm just going to jump right in and address the elephant in the room. Debates over same-sex marriage are extremely polarizing. There are probably some in the room who disagree with the Church's teaching, and certainly at this university and in the broader culture, there are many who not only are unconvinced by the Church's teaching, but who think that it is actually harmful or discriminatory or destructive. And all four of tonight's panelists, myself included, support the Church's teaching. So here we find ourselves in a difficult situation. And it was an honor for me to be invited to this panel, but not an entirely simple decision to attend. As a gay Catholic who embraces and defends the Church's teaching on chastity and sexuality, I have complicated feelings about gay marriage politics. Over the last 45 years or so, most of the culture has turned away from the understanding of marriage and human sexuality enshrined in the natural law and in Catholic teaching. When no-fault divorce laws were enacted, there was no outcry of the kind that we've seen around same-sex marriage. In most parishes, if you're cohabiting with your boyfriend or girlfriend and come for marriage preparation, there will be little, if any, eyebrow raised if you come to get married. Now, I grew up in a Southern Baptist church, and on questions like contraception and divorce, that church was willing to accommodate the sexual revolution. fully embracing contraception and offering far more latitude for divorce than I think the New Testament can allow. Premarital sex was not approved, but it was handled without hellfire and with grace and pastoral concern. On the other hand, in that church, I heard sermons that if America did not reinstate the death penalty for homosexuality, God would destroy America the way that he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. When I was an undergrad at the University of Washington, and this was before I became Catholic, I was a member for a while of Antioch Bible Church, whose senior pastor, Ken Hutcherson, preached adamantly about homosexuality as an abomination, and in private used slurs like faggot. In later years, he became a very active advocate against same-sex marriage. He opposed anti-bullying efforts in the schools and organized the 2004 May Day for Marriage rally in Washington, D.C. So he's not a minor figure. He became an important figure in opposition to same-sex marriage. So, as a gay Christian who's seeking to obey biblical teaching about homosexuality in these churches, the Southern Baptist Church that I grew up in, or Antioch Bible Church where I went for a time in college, I was asking for bread and was given a stone. And I think this is a problem that is certainly not universal in conservative churches in the United States today, but is not so rare that we can just ignore it and pretend that it doesn't exist. I think the experience that many people will have is that homosexual sins are being graded on a very, very different curve than heterosexual sins. And in Romans 2, the Apostle Paul, addressing hypocrisy of Jewish religious leaders, says, "You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you." Now, if I thought that the church's teaching were just based in that kind of bigotry, obviously I would not be here today. I would not be sharing the table with people who I've, in many cases, known for a long time and who I believe are sincere advocates of a consistent sexual ethic. But I think it's important to recognize that some of those who are maybe here worried about what they're going to hear, or people in the campus community here or outside the university who raise protests about the church's teaching, in some cases there's legitimacy to questions, and we need to be willing to listen to that and address it. So, obviously, I didn't accept the view that just because I ran into some people who treated the church's teaching very hypocritically, that the teaching itself was illegitimate. And for the last several years, I've been writing about, trying to talk about how can we offer a positive pastoral example to men and women who are gay and lesbian, or who have same-sex attractions but wouldn't be comfortable embracing that label. How can we talk about ways for them to respond to God's calling and use their gifts in the church in a positive way, without being, as I say, graded on a different curve? In the last couple of years, that has focused around a blog called Spiritual Friendship, easy enough to find, spiritualfriendship.org, where about a dozen different writers, some academics across philosophy, theology, psychology, some just with more, like there's Eve Tushnet, who's kind of public intellectual, have just basically explored a lot of different ways, particularly focusing on friendship, but how can we make sense of the church's teaching as something that can be offered as a positive vocation to people rather than just as no, don't have gay sex, or rather than just a negative political message on same-sex marriage. So with that, the topic that I want to talk about a little bit more is how do we try to understand more deeply the church's teaching on chastity? And obviously, if you look at the culture, we tend to have a debate that is very shallow, that there's a lot of slogans yelled back and forth, but a real challenge on getting deeper engagement. And P.S., the problem is not only with people like the pastors that I spoke of earlier. This just angry lashing out occurs on both sides. Almost 20 years ago, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Washington, I was browsing in Magus Books, a used bookstore near campus that absorbed far too much of my income at the time. And I picked up a copy of Glenn Tinder's Political Thinking, The Perennial Questions. It's a book which in the intervening decades I have dog-eared, highlighted, and underlined to within an inch of its life. In chapter 1, Tinder stresses the difficulty of serious political thinking and observes that contemporary American culture is less well-disposed to serious political thinking than many others. One reason for this, he thinks, is our propensity to action. He says, Americans have always had this propensity, which our environment necessitated and rewarded. Today, this traditional American inclination has been reinforced by the multitude and gravity of the problems confronting us, problems such as urban disintegration and persisting racial injustice, or we could say, marriage. Politically conscious Americans are intensely preoccupied with all the things that demand doing and are confident of our power to do these things successfully. This dynamic spirit is in many ways advantageous. Despondency is avoided and great tasks are often accomplished. But it makes people impatient with reflection and disinclined to entertain questions that do not have immediate practical urgency. They seek plans of action. And I think if we look at the debate today and look at just how much clash there is, it's obvious that somehow we need to move towards asking deeper questions. We need to find ways to deepen the conversation. Now, I bought Tinder's book almost 20 years ago, but I'm still thinking about the questions it raises. Now, to think politically about the perennial questions, almost by definition, is a lifelong project. And it's one that has continued to bear fruit in deeper understanding as long as I've continued to engage in it. Now, it is, in that respect, rather like a marriage. What I want to suggest tonight is that there's a relationship, a deeper relationship than we usually recognize, between the virtues necessary for the kind of disciplined political thinking that Tinder talks about and the virtues necessary for successful marriage and family life. Particularly, I want to draw a connection between the virtue of understanding and the virtue of chastity, which Thomas Aquinas draws in the Summa. One clue to this connection can be found in the King James translation of the book of Genesis, where we read that Adam knew his wife and conceived and bore a son. Now, we might think that this is just a euphemism, but it is in fact the best available translation of the Hebrew verb, which means to know. And I want to suggest that to say that Adam knew his wife conveys a much deeper truth about marriage than just to say that Adam had sex. Marriage is a communion of persons. It's not just a meeting of bodies. It is a comprehensive bodily and spiritual union. And it's a profound insight into human nature and the nature of conjugal union to describe it as a way for husband and wife to know each other. Human beings are rational animals. We're embodied spirits. And so what we do has to express both our rationality and our embodiedness. And this is particularly realized in the marital union. Another thing to say, virtue involves ordering our passions according to right reason. So, for example, the virtue of chastity is to be able to order our sexual desires in accordance with right reason, in accordance with the plan that God wrote into the creation, a plan which can be discerned by natural reason, but which is also revealed to us in Scripture and in the teaching of the Church. Now, the natural law invites us to reflect deeply on human nature and the purpose for which we are created the way we are created. But lust invites us to take a very shallow view of others. Instead of the patient probing the depths of reality that's required in understanding and probing the depths of another person that is involved in chastity and marriage, lust tempts us to see others at a very surface level. And it therefore draws us away from that kind of understanding, that willingness to dig deeply and to allow the world to reveal itself to us. So, as we look around at American culture, we see a culture that is unable to engage in this kind of deep political thinking. And I think that inability is in part rooted in the way that we have become, as a culture, so enslaved to lust. Now, today is the first Monday of Lent. And I think it would be appropriate in this context to think briefly about the readings from Mass today. The first reading from the book of Daniel, the people confess that they have sinned, that they have done evil, that they have ignored God's mercy. It is a reading of a culture that has turned away from God and has not only turned away from God's commands, but even turned away, to some extent, from God's mercy. However, the gospel is a proclamation of mercy and an instruction to approach others with that mercy. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Stop judging, and you will not be judged. Stop condemning, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. I think the problem that I addressed at the beginning of the way that some who have compromised on some aspects of the sexual revolution but condemn others are a real counter-witness to the gospel. But if we respond to this call to bear witness in a way that recognizes our own sin, recognizes our struggles, then I think we have a very different witness to give to the culture. I'll just close with the gospel for next Sunday is the woman at the well. You probably know the story. This woman has had 5 husbands, and the man that she's with now is not her husband. And Christ confronts her with that, but then she goes back to the town and tells them, "Come and see this man who told me everything that I ever did." And the people of the town come and are converted. And I think if we look at ourselves, we look at our culture, we see few of us are in a position to cast the first stone. But go out into our culture and say, "Come and see the man who told us everything that we ever did wrong." And invite them to him and see how even that very imperfect witness can bear fruit in the conversion of a culture that was previously alien to the gospel. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Ron. That was fantastic. And thanks to Michael Bradley and everybody else who's organizing this. It's an honor to be here. We're here to talk about the church's theology of marriage, but the first thing to note about that theology is that it is not just a theology. By the church's own lights, it's an ethic. It's something about the human good and not just about a sacrament. And beyond an ethic, it's also a kind of political philosophy. It's a vision for the human good, but also for the common good. And by the church's own lights, both of those aspects of marriage, what it is, the norms that it gives rise to that Ron so eloquently spoke about in their integrity, and what it implies for society, are things that you can know by reason and not just by revelation. And so that's an important part of understanding the role of the church's witness on these issues. And so that's what I and Ryan in particular are going to address, and then Dr. Morse is going to address as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the ethic of marriage that's behind the church's teaching, the vision of the human good, what we can know about it from reason. Ryan and Dr. Morse in different ways will talk about the social dimension. The first thing to note about the church's ethic of marriage is that it's not just based on tradition. Most people in the political debate will just say, well, marriage is a man and a woman because that's how it's always been. On the church's view, it's a matter of reason as well. But it's not simply a matter of arguing from equality. On the church's view, and I think in fact, you can't get any conclusion about what marriage really is or what vision of marriage to enshrine in the law just from the principle of equality. And the reason is that the contemporary debate about same-sex relationships, just like I think the debate about no-fault divorce and other kind of policy issues in the past, is really a debate between two visions of what marriage is, two visions of the ethic of marriage. On the main contender in favor of recognizing same-sex relationships as marriages, what vision of marriage is that embodying? In our book, we call it the revisionist view of marriage because it's proposing to revise the current understanding. But you can think about what it sees as distinctive of marriage as a human good by thinking about the kinds of relationships it would count in or out. So if you have two men who are living together, sharing all the burdens and benefits of common life, maybe even they're raising a child from one of them if one of them is a widower, if what brought them together was the child and they happen to be brothers, so they're not in a sexual relationship, the relationship isn't recognized as a marriage on this new view. If what brought them together is a romantic relationship, then it is. So the thing that's distinguishing marriage on this new or revisionist view is a certain kind of emotional union or intensity or regard. It's not the only thing in marriage, but it's what makes it different. It's what sets it apart. And the first thing I want to suggest is that that vision of marriage gets marriage wrong, not just by the church's lights, not just according to Genesis, but by reason. That there are common convictions on both sides of the debate, understandings about what makes marriage different, that this view of marriage can't account for. The first thing, just to take an example, think of the norm of permanence. Most people on both sides of the debate think that at least to get off the ground at all, for a relationship to be a marriage, it has to be pledged to permanence. But if the revisionist view of marriage is right, if what makes marriage different is a certain kind of emotional union or intensity or regard, then that view doesn't make sense. There's no more reason of principle to pledge permanence than to pledge to be together for as long as love lasts, where love is a certain kind of emotional regard. After all, that's what makes it a marriage, and if that's gone, it reverts to a friendship. The norm of exclusivity, the idea that, again, to get a marriage off the ground, you have to pledge exclusivity, doesn't make sense on this new view of marriage. Because if what really makes the marriage is a certain kind of emotional union for emotional and personal fulfillment, then it's true that exclusivity, for some people by temperament or taste or practice, is going to foster emotional union. But if in a particular case it doesn't, if the couple themselves feel that having a sexually open relationship would better foster emotional regard, then there's no reason of principle to say they have to pledge exclusivity. And in fact, it becomes just as arbitrary and kind of external an imposition as the norm of sexual complementarity. The idea that marriage is inherently a relationship of two people, same thing goes. It's true that two men, as well as a man and a woman, can have a certain kind of deep emotional regard, romantic commitment. But the same is true of three men, for example. So the idea that marriage is inherently a relationship of two people starts to look arbitrary as well. And even the idea, probably the most common idea on both sides of the debate, that marriage is an inherently sexual relationship, starts to look arbitrary on this view. Because remember, what makes a marriage on this view is the intensity, the degree, perhaps the shade, the quality of the commitment as a romantic bond. But there's no reason of principle that deep emotional union should be sexual. If all that the sexual activity is contributing to the relationship is to foster and express affection, then in principle it's replaceable with other kinds of activity that foster vulnerability and openness and self-disclosure and affection. So even the idea that marriage is inherently sexual starts to look arbitrary. In other words, on this new vision of marriage, it's not just a question of whether you expand or restrict the pool of eligibility. It's the question of whether you replace the current principle of marriage with a different principle that can't make sense of permanence or exclusivity or monogamy or even the idea of a sexual union at all. It can't make sense of any of the other features that set marriage apart. So even before you get to morality, in the sense of sort of moral prohibitions of this or that kind of conduct, before you get to theology, before you get to Genesis, you can see by common lights on both sides of the debate, by reason, that this view of marriage is off. The natural next question is, well, what is the alternative? What's the other view of marriage without appealing to these sources in Revelation that can explain all the features that the revisionist view cannot? And in our book, we try to give one articulation, one kind of unified account of that vision of marriage, which we call the conjugal view. But there are certainly lots of ways to approach it. Because the truth about this view is that it's not just originating in Genesis. As Professor Finnis has written in many scholarly publications, there's something remarkably similar to this vision of marriage and sex and sexuality in the work of Plato and Socrates, well, the words of Socrates and Aristotle and Xenophanes and Musonius Rufus and Plutarch. Folks who never touched a Baltimore Catechism, who had no connection to Judaism or Christianity, and who had remarkably convergent views, enough that there's an ancient philosophy scholar at Princeton who said to his chagrin that Plato and Paul VI pretty much agreed about sex and marriage. So it's remarkable convergence. And what accounts for it, right? What's the human good that all of these traditions are converging on? Well, the way we summarize it is by the idea of comprehensive union. What does that mean? Well, in all the dimensions that make a communion of persons at all, in Ron's term, in all of those dimensions, the communion of marriage is comprehensive. Well, what are those dimensions? Any form of community, we think, is created by common action. It's activity towards common ends in the context of a commitment. And in those three ways, unifying activity, unifying ends, and unifying commitment, what makes marriage different is its comprehensiveness. So take the first, unifying activity. Most people, again, on both sides agree that whatever marriage is, it's a union in some sense at all levels of the person. It's a union not just of heart and mind, but of heart, mind, and body. And again, most think that sexual activity has something to do with the bodily dimension of that union. Well, how is that? So we suggest you think about the union of parts within a person. What makes my heart and my lungs and the other parts of me one flesh is that they're all actively coordinated together towards a single end of the whole that they make up, which is my biological life. And the remarkable thing about being a human being is that that radical kind of bodily union is possible between two people, but just in one respect. Only in what our tradition, legally as well as theologically, has long called the marital act, do a man and a woman themselves become actively coordinated towards a single end of the whole that they make up. The end is reproduction, and the whole is the couple as such. So in the marital act, a man and a woman become, in a quite literal sense, one at the bodily level, in just the way that the parts of a single person are one. So that's unifying activity. Unifying ends. Most people get the sense that while different forms of community are usually defined, they're oriented towards particular goods. So an academic community like this one is oriented towards the goods of football and towards the goods of knowledge and understanding. And a sports community is oriented towards the goods involved in sports. I was never good at those myself, so I can't tell you what those are. The communion of marriage is oriented not just towards this or that good, but somehow towards the whole wide range of goods that's realized in domestic life. And what explains that? Well, in the revisionist view, it's just a matter of choice. It's the choice to live together and to have this common life. But of course, if it were just a matter of choice, again, there wouldn't be any reason that 3 people or 2 people without a sexual relationship or other configurations couldn't just choose it. So we know there's something deeper to it, and the conjugal view explains it. The reason that marriage is oriented towards not just this or that good, but the whole range of goods, is because it's oriented at bottom towards whole new human beings. New subjects, new participants in every good. And the reason that's true is that the very act that makes marital love is also the kind of act that makes new life. So marriage itself, the relationship embodied by that act, is also fulfilled by new life and by its own fulfillment in education and rearing. So comprehensive in its unifying ends. And the last and perhaps simplest point is that if your union is comprehensive in those 2 senses, in the dimensions of the partners united, one flesh, and in its embodiment, in its characteristic fruit, in whole new human beings, one flesh in quite literal sense, then it ought to be comprehensive in its commitment. And comprehensive commitment through time means permanence, and at each time means exclusivity. So permanence, exclusivity, monogamy, sexual union, connection to family life, and through family life to the common good, as Ryan and Dr. Morse will talk about. All of the very features that the revisionist view can't make sense of, that disaggregates, the conjugal view gives unity to. Well, how does this link up to the Church's witness on marriage? I want to end with just 2 quick points about that, even before you get to the way this might explain the connection between marriage and the common good, the way that marriage is of interest to the state and the way that baptisms aren't, even though both are sacraments. The first thing is that this vision of marriage makes it clearer that the sexual ethic of the Church is not just a grab bag of norms, and it's not just something you can pick and choose from, as Ron so eloquently pointed out. The fundamental distinction in the Church's sex ethic, and apparently in Plato's sex ethic, is not gay or straight, same-sex or opposite sex. The fundamental distinction is marital or not. You can summarize the whole range of norms by saying you should not seek the experience of comprehensive union without the reality of comprehensive union. It's an ethic of truth. It's an ethic that says to be really loving, you have to be in connection, in harmony with the truth about the beloved and your relationship to them. And if it doesn't have comprehensive union, either because it doesn't have bodily union, or because it doesn't have total commitment, or because you already gave your commitment to someone else, or because it's not bodily union because it's not really open to the fulfillment of bodily union in family life, then you shouldn't seek the experience of comprehensive union because that creates a divide within you. It divides reality from experience, which is bad. The second thing that it makes clear is that it explains how there can be vocations to something other than marriage. How is that? Well, if you really have the revisionist view, you think marriage is just defined by its degree. It's the maximum of what makes any kind of relationship or form of community valuable. There's shared emotions and experience, and if you've got that to the max, you've got marriage, which implies that if you don't have marriage, you just settle for less. That's one of the reasons that the church's view feels so offensive and so harmful to so many people, because they're already assuming their own revisionist understanding of marriage as the max. On this view, it's not the max. It's one form, one basic type of communion, of love with its own particular norms and shape and distinctive forms of unity. One among many types of love. And that's why the church has always recognized the validity and the great moral and spiritual value of celibate forms of life, where it's not just less, you're not just preventing yourself from one good, you're opening yourself up to different types of good, different ways of building up the kingdom in your corner of the world. And so it really does, in that second sense, make clear again that the fundamental distinction on the church's ethic, on this general ethic, is not married or unmarried, gay or straight, member of this or that family or household, but son or daughter of God, made in his image, destined for his household, and for building it up through a personal vocation to love that's specific to you. Thanks.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you for having me. The last time I think I was in this room, I was proctoring an exam as a teaching assistant. And so I had this bad flashback that I was going to have 90 blue books to grade tonight. And I'm happy I get to get on a plane and not do that. But I have a different flashback. I met with my dissertation advisor earlier today, and I have a lot of revisions to make. That said, Sharif and I, with a third co-author, we wrote a book together about marriage. And Sharif's kind of given you the first half of that book in a 15-minute summary of what marriage is. I get to do the second half of that book, the summary of why marriage matters, particularly from a policy perspective. I work at a policy think tank in Washington, and so the perspective that I'll be coming from is one of public policy. There's a question of sacramental theology, of how should the church understand matrimony as a sacrament. There's a question of philosophical reality, what is the relationship of marriage. Then there's a further question, why should the government care? Why should the government be in the bedroom? Because by recognizing marriage, by regulating marriage in certain ways, by defining marriage, it's going to be in the marriage business. And the question is why? How should it understand marriage for public policy purposes? Because even those who would redefine marriage to include same-sex relationships would still have the state in the marriage business. And what is the reason? What's the purpose about marriage? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've called the social function of marriage. What social function does marriage perform? And I think taken from this perspective, marriage exists as a policy institution to unite a man and a woman as husband and wife, to then be mother and father to any children that that union might create. It's based on the anthropological truth that men and women are distinct and complementary. It's based on the biological fact that the union of a man and a woman can produce a child. And it's based on the social reality that a child deserves a mother and a father. Whenever a baby is born, a mother will always be close by. She's frequently in the same room. The question for policy is, will a father be close by? And if so, for how long? And marriage is the institution that different societies throughout history and across the globe, societies that Sharif mentioned that had no contact with the Jewish or the Christian scriptures, understood to be that institution that maximizes the likelihood that that man commits to that woman, and then the two of them, permanently and exclusively bonded to each other, take responsibility to raise any children that they produce. Part of this understanding of marriage is based on a reality that there's no such thing as parenting in the abstract. There's mothering and there's fathering. We quote a Rutgers University sociologist, David Popenoe, who wrote a long book about the importance of fathers. This was when the biggest social crisis in America vis-a-vis the marriage debate was the absentee father crisis. I still think this is the biggest crisis in the marriage debate, but that's no longer how it's framed. And he wrote a book looking at the social science and what we know about parenting. And this was one of his facts, one of his discoveries. Quote, The burden of social science evidence support the idea that gender-differentiating parenting is important for human development and that the contribution of fathers to child rearing is unique and irreplaceable. He then concluded, quote, "We should disavow the notion that mommies can make good daddies, just as we should disavow the popular notion that daddies can make good mommies. The two sexes are different to the core, and each is necessary culturally and biologically for the optimal development of a human being," end quote. And one way to think about this is to do a thought experiment. If I told you it's Saturday morning and that a 5-year-old boy is in the living room wrestling with one of his parents, and the parent is teaching the 5-year-old how to be masculine without being violent, that it's okay to put people in headlocks, but not to bite or pull hair or to gouge out eyes. Which parent is most likely in the living room? It's the father. And this isn't because we've somehow socially conditioned gender norms and stereotypes so that only fathers can wrestle on living room floors. This is just typically what comes natural to dads. They're the ones that are most likely, on average and for the most part, to be throwing a newborn baby up in the air while the mother says, "Honey, don't throw him so high." Not because we've somehow conditioned women to engage in a gender stereotypical behavior of, caring and comforting. That's what comes naturally to them. And so then it's not surprising when you look at the social science about boys who grow up without their fathers in their lives, they're more likely to commit crime and to spend time in jail. Because that wrestling on Saturday morning actually matters. That Saturday morning wrestling is one of the ways in which a father helps his son develop into a mature adult male who can check his aggression, who knows how to channel his aggression in a constructive rather than a destructive way. It's not to say that mothers can't do this. It's to say that fathers, on average, are better equipped and more inclined to do this, and that the social science then shows that there are, at the aggregate, differences. Fathers do something different but complementary for their daughters. It's typically the father that scares away the bad boyfriend. The reason why is that the father tends to be a little bit larger than the mother, the father's voice tends to be a bit deeper than the mother's, but also the father was once a teenage boy himself, and he knows what the wrong sort of teenage boy is looking for in his daughter. A father who's married to his daughter's mother also models what a good marital relationship looks like, and models for his daughter what she might look for in a marriageable man. Then when we look at the social science, when they aggregate this, we see that girls who grow up without a father in their lives are more likely to experience an out-of-wedlock childbirth, or at least an out-of-wedlock pregnancy. Whether or not the birth happens is a second question. Again, this isn't to say that anyone who is raised in a single-parent home is somehow destined for failure or doom. That's not what we're suggesting. It is to say that marriage makes a difference, and that being raised by a mother and a father makes a difference. And that's what hooks the state in the marriage business. The state's not in the marriage business because it cares about my love life or your love life. If marriage was just about a romantic union, in the way that Sharif describes the revisionist account of marriage, we wouldn't need government in the marriage business. We could take the government out of the bedroom. The reason the government's in the marriage business is that that sexual union of a man and a woman can create a child, and that man and that woman need to commit to each other and raise that child, or else someone else will, frequently at great social cost. These facts about marriage and fathers are so accepted, they've made it into the mainstream. So in the book, we cite President Obama. The president said, just before he evolved on the marriage issue, quote, "We know the statistics that children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of schools, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They are more likely to have behavioral problems or run away from home or become teenage parents themselves. And the foundations of our community are weaker because of it." Now, President Obama there was not condemning or in any way denigrating single mothers. He was raised by a heroic single mother, and he speaks movingly about that and about his grandparents. And he describes how growing up without a father has actually inspired him to be a better father to the 2 daughters that he's raising. That's what the marriage institution, understood as a public policy institution, is about. At one point in American life, virtually every child was born and raised by their married mother and father. And in the past 40 to 50 years, through results like Ron mentioned of no-fault divorce and the rise in divorce rates, through the results of premarital and extramarital sex, through the results of cohabitation and the hookup culture, we've now seen that 40% of all Americans, 50% of Hispanics, and 70% of African Americans are born outside of marriage. And these children are disadvantaged through no fault of their own. Children outside of marriage are more likely to experience poverty, less likely to experience social mobility, more likely to end up in jail, and the welfare state is more likely to continue to grow exponentially. So everything that you could care about, if you care about social justice and you care about limited government, if you care about freedom and you care about the poor, is better served by a healthy marriage culture than by broken marriages where the state then tries to pick up the pieces. That said, in the time that I have left, I just want to point to 3 ways in which redefining marriage would have consequences. One of the most frequent questions that I think are put to all 4 of us on this panel is, well, how does letting Adam and Steve get married impact you, your marriage, or anyone else's marriage? What would be the consequence of redefining marriage to include same-sex relationships? And I'll group all 3 of these consequences under the umbrella category of ideas have consequences, and bad ideas have bad consequences. The first consequence is, if you redefined marriage, there would be no institution left in public life that upheld, even as an ideal, that every child deserves a mother and a father. To say that every child deserves a mother and a father would be marginalized and labeled as hate speech. Increasingly, it already is being marginalized and labeled as hate speech. There would be no institution that exists to suggest that a man and a woman should commit to each other permanently and exclusively rather than for as long as the love lasts, so that their children have both a mother and a father. And the law teaches, and in teaching the law shapes culture, culture then shapes beliefs, and beliefs shape action. And the clearest way of seeing how the law functions like this is to look at the example that Ron gave us at the beginning with no-fault divorce. Prior to the redefinition of marriage, to making it a temporary relationship, divorce rates were in the near single digits. After the introduction of no-fault divorce, they more than doubled. We now have a divorce rate somewhere in the 40s. 40% of all marriages end in divorce. What happened was that the law changed what it taught. In the common law tradition, divorce was allowed under the 3 A's of abuse, abandonment, and adultery. Serious reasons for taking a relationship that's expected to be permanent and calling quits. Your spouse is abusing you, your spouse has abandoned you, your spouse has committed adultery on you. With the introduction of no-fault divorce, a spouse could abandon a spouse for any reason or for no reason at all. What that taught was that marriage need not even aspire to be a permanent union. And we internalized that message. So now the question would be, if the biggest social problem we face is absentee fathers, in the way that I think it is, in the way that President Obama in the past has spoken that it is, how will the law teach that fathers are essential when it's redefined marriage to make fathers optional? That's the first consequence. The second consequence, again under the category of ideas have consequences, is that there would be no principled reason for the redefinition of marriage to stop here. And Sharif's presentation hinted at the reasons why. That the revisionist view of marriage makes the norm of permanency, exclusivity, and monogamy wholly arbitrary. In fact, it's so arbitrary that activists have created 3 new words to redefine marriage on those 3 dimensions. And I'll briefly just mention those 3. The first is the word throuple. A throuple is a 3-person couple. We came across this term in New York Magazine. And the argument here is that you can have an intense emotional union with more than 2 people. This has been something that occurs in human history. It's taking place right now in Brooklyn. The magazine was highlighting a Brooklyn couple. It's taking place. There was another Washington magazine did a story about this about a year after New York Magazine. Washington's a little bit behind the curve from New York. There are thruples in DC. And the argument here is that once you redefine marriage to say the union of a man and a woman is arbitrary and irrational, what's magical about the number 2? What's the principled basis for denying marriage equality to thruples if you're in favor of marriage equality for the same-sex couple? Because the way that we got at monogamy is that it's one man and one woman who can unite in that comprehensive act that Sharif described, who can then produce children, and every child has one mother and one father. That's where we get the public policy norm of twosomes. But once you say that's irrational and arbitrary and just a result of animus, why would you deny marriage equality to thruples? It seems there's no principled reason. The next term we came across was the term monogamish. This was in the New York Times Sunday magazine, a very prominent outlet, the New York Times. The Sunday magazine, probably the most coveted part of the Sunday Times. This was by the gay rights activist Dan Savage, and it was under the rubric of what can straight couples learn from same-sex couples. And he was saying they could learn the virtue of the monogamish relationship. He wanted to keep the number 2, so he's not necessarily in favor of thruples, but he wanted to do away with sexual exclusivity, what we think of as the virtue of fidelity. He wanted to describe a new virtue, the virtue of monogamish relationships. And he was saying that provided there's no coercion and no deceit, there's no reason in principle why marital unions couldn't be sexually open. He thought that it was somewhat unrealistic to think that you could have all of your sexual needs met by one person for the rest of your life. And that part of the problem of marriage was that heterosexuals had these outdated, uptight norms about sexuality, and that things would go better, their emotional union would be enhanced if they were able to find sexual outlets outside of marriage. So that was doing away with the norm of exclusivity by redefining infidelity as the virtue of monogamish. The last term was the term wed lease, and this we came across in the Washington Post the month after the Supreme Court struck down the Defense of Marriage Act. And this was written by a lawyer in the Washington Post, and he was saying just like you can lease a car or lease a house, you should be able to lease your spouse. He wanted to do away with the expectation of permanency. His argument was we should have 5 or 10-year marriage licenses, which can then be renewed on good behavior. The idea here is that we have this outdated notion that we can pledge to love one person exclusively for the rest of life. And because we have this unrealistic expectation, when marriages fall apart, when we can't live up to that expectation, that's what causes the heartache of divorce. If we were only expecting a 5 or a 10-year wed lease rather than wedlock, that was his cute play on words, then our hearts wouldn't be broken and divorce wouldn't be a bad proceeding. Now, whatever you think about the theology or the morality of thruples, monogamish relationships, and wed leases, think about the public policy consequences of multi-partner sexual unions, sexually open unions, and temporary sexual unions. All of those activities increase the likelihood that men create children with multiple women to whom they are not committed, directly undercutting the public policy purpose of why the state's in the marriage business in the first place. So that's the second consequence, is that there would be no principled stopping point once you get rid of the male-female aspect. In the 2 minutes I have left, I'll just briefly mention the last consequence. This is the consequence for religious liberty. We've already seen in the state of Massachusetts, in the state of Illinois, and in Washington, D.C., that Catholic Charities has more or less been forced out of the foster care and adoption space. In the case of Massachusetts, it was explicit that it wasn't about state funding, it was about licensing. It's illegal to run an adoption agency without an adoption license, and the government said we will not grant you an adoption license unless you agree to place the orphans in your care with same-sex married couples on an equal footing as you do with married couples. Catholic Charity says, wait, we have social science that suggests children do best with a mom and a dad. 2, we're not trying to deny anyone adoption abilities from other agencies, so we're not trying to prevent same-sex couples from adopting from the secular humanist adoption agency. We just don't want to do those adoptions ourselves. And third, we have First Amendment protections for the free exercise of religion. Nevertheless, the jurisdictions said, no, we won't give you the adoption license. This did nothing to help those children. This did nothing to score a point for social justice, finding homes for orphans. All it did was score a point for political correctness. We've then seen instances of photographers and florists and bakers and innkeepers who have said, we have no problem baking cakes or taking pictures for gays and lesbians, but we don't want to celebrate a same-sex relationship or a same-sex wedding as if it's a marriage when that violates our beliefs about marriage. We think God has given us artistic talents of baking and floral arrangements and photography, and we don't want to use our God-given talents to tell a lie about God's intentions for marriage. In none of these jurisdictions do evangelicals have a monopoly on photography or cake baking, so there were more than enough other vendors who were happy to take the couple's money and make a profit by baking a cake or taking pictures, and yet in each of these jurisdictions, the couple filed a complaint against the evangelical or the Catholic photographer, baker, and florist. The case that has progressed the furthest is the case of Elaine Photography out of New Mexico. This was back in 2006 that the couple filed the initial complaint. She went before the New Mexico Commission on Human Rights and was ordered to pay a fine of almost $7,000 because she denied the human rights of the couple that was seeking for her to take their same-sex wedding photos. She then appealed this to the New Mexico Supreme Court, which this past summer ruled against her. And in a concurring opinion, the judge wrote that the price of citizenship was that Elaine had to take these pictures. When I got to that passage in the opinion, I thought it was going to say that the price of citizenship is that the couple should just go to a different photographer. That would be the live and let live philosophy of America's free market. But no, it was that the price of citizenship was that every photographer has to take the same-sex wedding photos. So the coercion here works in the exact opposite way of which it's normally discussed. Everyone is free to live and to love how they want to. Two people of the same sex can live together, love each other. They can go to a liberal church and have a wedding ceremony. They can work for a progressive business and receive benefits, marriage benefits, if the church wants to and if the business wants to. What's at stake with redefining marriage is whether or not the government will coerce all citizens, all religious communities except for the four walls of a church on Sunday morning, and all businesses into treating the same-sex couple as if it's a marriage, even when it violates those citizens, those religious communities, and those businesses' beliefs about marriage. And so that's the third consequence of redefining marriage, the religious liberty consequence. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Morse.
Well, it's a pleasure to be at Notre Dame on St. Patrick's Day. I've heard about the Fighting Irish, and I wondered if there were any praying Irish. So I went to the Basilica for Mass at 11:30 and saw quite a few praying Irish. So it's a great pleasure and gift to be here on this occasion. As Michael mentioned, I am the founder and president of the Ruth Institute, and we're a pro-marriage outfit that struggles to present lifelong married love as an appealing option for people and to see the benefits of it. And so if you would like to be involved with us and like to get information about us, I have cards here where you can sign up, and I have a whole variety of materials that you can look at later. If anybody would like that, you can come talk to me. And I also have fully footnoted copies of my speech in case there's any press here who's interested in what I have to say. So my theme for this evening is how the debate over removing the gender requirement from marriage fits into the wider picture of the sexual revolution. I'm going to say a few words about how we got to this point and a few words about how I think we're going to end up if we continue down this path. But first of all, I'd like to offer two apologies. I was brought up in the 1950s. You all have no doubt been told that this was a dark time, filled with women in abusive, loveless marriages and men in dreary conformist jobs. Now, I don't know what it was like to be an adult back then, but I do know that it was actually a pretty good time to be a child. So I would like to apologize to the greatest generation. Perhaps some of you missed that connection. Those dreadful people of the 1950s were the greatest generation. These are the people who fought and defeated fascism in Europe and who lived through the Great Depression without allowing the country to become communist. I want to say that my parents did not deserve what I did to them, and the greatest generation as a whole did not deserve what the baby boom generation did to them. I'm sorry for what I did to my parents and for my participation in the sexual revolution generally. And I think it's only common decency that somebody say so while there's still somebody left alive to hear it. They're dying off by the day, the greatest generation. I recently buried my last uncle. And as I watched his friends from the VFW and the American Legion saluting his remains, I was heartbroken to think of what we have allowed this country to become. If any of you still have parents or grandparents who are alive from that greatest generation, please thank them for me and tell them that I said I'm sorry. I also wish to apologize to all of you, the millennial generation. My generation has left you guys a mess. We've allowed a particularly destructive vision of human sexuality to dominate the culture. And I say to you, too, I'm sorry for my participation in the sexual revolution and for my indifference to the larger consequences of my own actions and the ideology that was developing around me. It's my belief that the sexual revolution has been flawed from the beginning. When I use the term sexual revolution, I have two main ideas in mind. First, the sexual revolutionaries hold that society ought to separate sex and procreation from each other and ought to separate both from marriage. Second, the sexual revolutionaries teach that men and women are completely interchangeable for all socially significant purposes. Any observable differences between men and women are socially constructed and evidence of unwarranted discrimination. A just society must eradicate all these differences. Do you recognize this worldview that I'm describing? Now, whether we agree with it or not, we have to admit that the sexual revolutionary ideology is extremely seductive. Back in the 60s and 70s, we all thought it was going to be great fun to have sex without having babies. Of course, now we're at the point where we're having babies without having sex, which I'm pretty sure is not as much fun as the old-fashioned way, but I digress. And we believe that believing men and women are entirely interchangeable appeals to some kind of sense of justice and fairness. But in spite of the appeal of these ideas, there's just one problem. Both these ideas are false. I was once in a debate on the marriage issue, and I made what I thought was a completely unobjectionable statement. I said, sex makes babies. My opponent argued with me. She said, no, it doesn't. Oh, what do you mean, says I. And she says, unprotected sex makes babies. Oh, I see. Well, do you see the problem with this, my young friends? Sex actually does make babies. And these little contraceptive failures keep popping up over and over. Right around half of the women presenting themselves for abortion claim to have been using contraception during the month that they got pregnant. And only about 55% of the most highly educated women in America will say that they're using contraception every single time. Among those with a high school education or less, only about 19% use contraception every single time. It is completely irrational to believe that you can build a society around the premise that sex does not make babies. This is not possible. Now, besides, sex has other consequences that cannot be entirely contracepted away. For example, sex builds bonds between the people engaging in it. That is why the hookup culture can be so disappointing, especially for women. We have sex with guys who would be a disaster to be in a long-term relationship with. Yet our bodies try to bond even with the creep. And that, well, I'm sorry, I'm telling it like it is. You want my honest opinion? That's good. It's the only kind I have. Okay. This is why marriage is the proper context for both sexual activity and child rearing. Marriage, which is lifelong sexual exclusivity and the whole sharing of life, creates a social expectation and a support structure to unify people for the lifetime. Marriage allows a safe place for their bond to develop and deepen. Marriage prepares the couple for parenthood, should any children arrive. Marriage protects the parents' common interest in their children. And most importantly, this expectation and structure defending the permanence of the marital bond protects the legitimate interests that children have in the stability of their parents' union. The claim that men and women are completely interchangeable is also false. Boys and girls are different in utero, throughout childhood development, and all the way into adulthood. The idea that men and women are identical has led us to pursue a vision of equality that is making us miserable. To take just one example of many that I could name, we expect everyone to operate in higher education and in labor markets designed for people who never give birth to babies. That would be men. In many professions, including academia, law, and medicine, people are expected to get all their education and establish themselves professionally in their 20s. Once a person is established, only then can they think about extracurricular activities like having a baby. Now, a man can easily become a father into his 40s. A woman, not so much. This form of labor market equality, which disregards obvious and immutable differences between men and women, creates a trap for educated women. We value our education and careers, but by the time we're socially and economically ready for motherhood, our peak fertility is behind us. Many educated women end up with far fewer children than they really wanted, or perhaps not even married. The sexual revolution offered us a deal. You can participate in higher education and in the labor market as long as you agree to chemically neuter yourselves during your 20s. And then during your 30s and 40s, you agree to undergo dangerous and possibly degrading and expensive infertility treatments. I say this is a bum deal for women. We've taken the labor market as given and adapted our bodies to it. I say society should take women's bodies as given and adapt the labor market to our bodies. Now, despite the fact that these are sophisticated and accomplished women, their misery is largely invisible to society. And so, most importantly, is the connection between their misery and the impossible ideal of equality and the contraception that makes it appear to be possible. I've coined a name for these victims of the sexual revolution, for their story is actually my story. I call them, and myself, heartbroken career women. Another corollary of the sexual revolutionary ideology is that adults are entitled to any sexual relationships they choose, and the children will be fine. The children must be fine. If the children aren't fine, we take them to therapy. We don't raise eyebrows at the parents and ask them to behave themselves or put up with each other or otherwise pull themselves together. We rationalize the behavior of the adults and we medicate the feelings of the children. A friend of mine once said, "Every family has its crosses. Divorce is when the adults put down the cross and the children pick it up." In a couple of weeks, one of my Ruth Institute colleagues, Jennifer Teamy, will be here to talk about some of our new initiatives reaching out to the children of divorce. We at the Ruth Institute believe it's high time someone cleaned up the mess after that big first step of the sexual revolution, namely no-fault or unilateral divorce. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it tonight. My point is simply that we've got victims, 40 years worth of victims from earlier stages of the sexual revolution. Now, since the sexual revolution isn't making people happy, some people are going to object to it. But the people in power who benefit from the ideology will take steps to protect the ideology from dissent. So along these lines, have any of you ever heard about the Affordable Care Act's Health and Human Services Contraceptive Suggestion? Have you ever heard of the Health and Human Services Affordable Care Act Contraceptive Option? I haven't either. It's the HHS contraceptive mandate. And why is that? It's because the federal government is enforcing one view of human sexuality on every health insurance provider in America. No resistance can be tolerated, no accommodation can be offered. Not only must resistance be crushed, but evidence that calls the revolutionary ideology into question must be suppressed. But since such evidence is going to continually appear because the tenets of the sexual revolution are false. The revolutionaries present a continual stream of propaganda designed to circle the wagons around their ideology, tamping down any evidence that contradicts it. I could offer many examples of this, but excuse me for a moment. I need to take off my jacket. I'm having a hot flash. I've been having hot flashes for over 10 years, but my doctor will not give me hormone replacement therapy because he says it increases the risks of strokes and heart attacks. But any of you college students here, young ladies here, went to the doctor for essentially the same hormones for contraceptive purposes, he would give it to you in a heartbeat without any questions. You might ask yourselves why this is so. The health risks associated with these hormonal contraceptives are so well known that the World Health Organization has classified them as a class 1 carcinogen. That is, a substance known to cause cancer in humans. But we continue to prescribe powerful and dangerous hormonal drugs to perfectly healthy young women. Those women whose health has been placed at risk or damaged by hormonal contraception are also victims of the sexual revolution. Now, you may have noticed that I have yet to say anything about removing the gender requirement for marriage, the policy that goes by the name of same-sex marriage, the reason that we presumably are all here to talk about. That's because I think you're all intelligent people, and you can connect the dots for yourself. If the earlier phases of the sexual revolution have not worked, why would we possibly expect this newer and even more radical phase to work? And I think you can see for yourself that redefining marriage is a way of further institutionalizing the tenets of the sexual revolution. In order to believe that genderless marriage is desirable or even possible, one has to already believe that men and women are completely interchangeable, that marriage is about the desires of adults and not about the needs of children, and that sex is normatively a sterile activity. Most importantly, one has to believe that it is the business of the government to accommodate adults in having the sexual experiences that they want, that it is not the business of the government to provide generational justice to children so that they can know and be known by both of their parents. One has to believe above all that kids will be fine with any configuration or reconfiguration of living arrangements that the adults decide they want. So let me say for the record, I do not accept it as normal that a child should be deprived of a relationship with a parent without a good reason. This is a structural injustice to the child. I do not accept it as normal that a child should move every other week, a fate that few adults would willingly endure. No matter how often this occurs, I do not accept it. Removing the gender requirement for marriage will not be the last step of the sexual revolution. The next steps will include children having three legal parents, and increasingly there's talk about technology that will allow DNA from 3 biological parents as well. We'll have the breakdown of the presumption that legal parenthood tracks biological parenthood. We'll have the introduction of contract parenting so that intended parents of any number and gender will be given legal parenting rights. And finally, we will have the commercialization of parenthood itself, with surrogacy and the sales of eggs and sperm becoming normalized, routine, and even celebrated. I will never accept it that some people are entitled to buy and sell other people, no matter how young or small. I will never accept it that women are permitted to systematically and purposely create fatherless children, and that the law will help them in doing this. I will never accept that rich old men should be permitted to exploit young women for their eggs and poor women for their wombs. I don't care what the law says or how many people do it. And for the record, let me emphasize, I don't care whether rich old men are straight or gay. Third-party reproduction should be shut down, not regulated, but shut down completely. It is a violation of the dignity and rights of the child. It is no business of the government to give legal sanction to these kinds of arrangements. In his dissent in the Windsor case, Justice Samuel Alito observed that the court is being asked to choose between two competing views of marriage. And I agree with Justice Alito. And I would add that behind the two views of marriage, there are also two views about sexuality, the human person, and even our place in the cosmos. One view of marriage and human sexuality will drive out the other. They cannot coexist. The Catholic view is the major competitor to the reigning ideology of the sexual revolution. The revolutionaries have known this from the beginning. That is why John D. Rockefeller devoted so much effort and attention to bringing his population council and their ideas about contraception and population control to this very university in the 1960s. He knew he had to do something to neutralize Catholic opposition to his plans. Now, I realize that not everybody here is Catholic. Even at Notre Dame, there are probably some of you who don't believe in God. Perhaps no one has proved the existence of God to your satisfaction, and of course no one can prove the existence of God, perhaps, or the non-existence of God. Just because you've never seen God doesn't mean he doesn't exist. So one way or the other, we have to make up our minds based on incomplete evidence. The Catholic view says that every child is a gift from God. The revolutionary view says every child is a choice, a problem to dispose of if you don't want one, and a commodity to obtain if you do want one. The modern world is living out the revolutionary view of sexuality and of the cosmos. We act as if we believe that we are alone in a meaningless and indifferent universe, as if we ourselves have no intrinsic value, that our sexual acts have no meaning aside from the meaning we assign to them, that our sexual acts are simply the actions of mindless particles bumping into each other from no particular cause at all and with no particular purpose in mind. In other words, the hookup culture is a metaphor for our beliefs about the cosmos. And the rich and powerful people of our country are enforcing this view of the cosmos and of sexuality upon us all, whether we like it or not. The Catholic view of all these matters is quite different. We believe that God loved the universe into existence and that God wishes for us to participate in this love. We believe that the marriage between one man and one woman is a symbol of God's faithful covenant with his people. We believe that every sexual act is deeply meaningful, whether we recognize that meaning or not. And we believe that the human body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, not a toy, not a shell, not an empty vessel. My young friends, whether you believe in all that the Catholic Church teaches or not, you have a choice about how to behave. The Catholic Church presents a real alternative to the empty, pointless cosmos. At the center of the universe is a deep, abiding love. We are called to be part of it. We Catholics are not ashamed to believe this, and we invite everyone to accept the challenge to live as if we were all loved into existence. Thank you very much.
Thank you once again to all four of our speakers for that presentation. We've got a full half hour now for question and answers, and so unfortunately we don't have microphones placed out in the auditorium. So if you do have a question, I just ask that you raise your hand and we'll call on you. And then if you could stand up and rather loudly, especially so that the cameras in the back can hear you. Just please announce your name, your affiliation with the university if you have one, and then in the interests of time especially, please just be concise and direct in addressing your questions to the panelists. So we'll just take them as they come. The Tocqueville program does make a habit of fielding questions from undergraduate students first, if there are any. You're not an undergraduate. Yes.
I like how you took the two different models of marriage, the revisionist model, I believe you referred to it as, and the conjugal model. And I think you did a good point with comparing the two as far as different aspects, sexual exclusivity, permanence. But what I feel like is you didn't address the permanence as far as the conjugal model. The way you explain the conjugal model, you might explain it more in depth in the book, is that the point of marriage is a procreative thing. But being together, a man and a woman having a child, I mean, up to 18 years later, the procreation's pretty much done. What part of that model says it has to be a permanent relationship?
Thanks. Okay, so I'll repeat the question. Sure. The question is, you know, that was a nice little dual model thing, and the way sexual exclusivity I saw the point of, and sexual union, but why in particular should, on the conjugal view, should marriage be committed to permanence? After all, if it's primarily about procreation, that takes 18 years, maybe a little bit longer in some cases, and then after that, aren't you? Yeah, that's right. I'm in my 20th year of school. So doesn't that, isn't the job done? Can't you go home at that point? So there are a number of ways of looking at this. The first thing I'll say is that on our articulation of it, procreation and orientation of family life is one dimension of comprehensive union. And the comprehensive union exists on the night of the honeymoon, whether or not there's children. A year before the first kid comes about, 10 years after the last kid goes off to college or grad school or whatever. And the key thing is that comprehensive union, so understood, is valuable in itself. There is something worth fostering and expressing and being faithful to. There's a good that makes demands on you before the kids come around, whether or not they come around in fact, and even after they leave if they do come. If marriage were just a means to kids, if it were only as valuable as the marginal increase in SAT scores that it produced if the couple stayed together, then your question would have more bite to it, I think, on the conjugal view. But if marriage has value in itself, if it has this structure that explains its value, even before the kids come about, even though an orientation of family life is one bit of that structure, then permanence, as a general rule, can make sense as an outflow of comprehensive union, of what it makes sense to pledge for that kind of relationship.
One other thing that I would say there is that in cultures that value extended family more, which is basically every culture but contemporary America, grandparents play a particularly important role in raising children. In fact, there are some models that suggest that a really important aspect of the emergence of human culture, as opposed to just the very simplistic social models that you see in animals, is the fact that human beings live long enough for there to be grandparents who pass on the knowledge to have more than just one generation involved in raising the family. And I would also just note that divorce, even children who are adults, the divorce of their parents is still has very serious emotional effects, and it also has very serious effects on the way that the parents are then able to participate in the life of their grandchildren.
Yes, I just wanted to add that at the Ruth Institute, we recently put on a program for adults that was called Healing the Family, and there were a lot of adult children of divorce. And one guy stood up and said basically what Ron just said, which was that his parents got divorced when he was a grown man and had children of his own, and as soon as the father left and went off and married another woman, he lost interest in his own grandchildren and became more interested in her and her family. And it was extremely hurtful to that whole side of the family. So I completely endorse what Ron said.
Question, comments? I'm a graduate student in the PhD program. This is a question directed mainly at Ryan, I guess. You wanted to draw on social science to defend the claim that the ideal for parenting is a man and woman, a biological mother and father. You cited a lot of data, which, as far as I know, is about heterosexual couples where the father leaves and outcomes being worse there than in heterosexual couples. You acknowledged the big body of scientific data, which all the professional social science organizations endorse, which show that regardless of who puts who in headlocks, looks like outcomes are about the same. Now, I know that you think that the scientific consensus is ill-founded, it's based on flawed studies and whatever. But I'm just wondering how we were supposed to get from the literature that you actually did cite to this pretty different conclusion about heterosexual couples being superior to gay couples.
Sure. He's asking a question about the social science on same-sex parenting and why it is that I didn't address that in what I said. And that's mainly because I wasn't talking about same-sex parenting. I was talking about why marriage matters for public policy. And the comparison I was drawing was not between the parenting of a married mother and father to the parenting of a same-sex couple, because I actually think we don't know much about that comparison, because there's only been about 3 studies that have actually used large, random, and representative samples. That wasn't the discussion I was having. I was having a discussion about 40 years and thousands of studies that use large, random, representative samples to look at the outcomes for children who were raised by an intact, married, biological mother and father as compared to divorce and remarriage, cohabitation, and single parenting. And we have about 40 years and thousands of studies of those relationship alternatives. all of which come out suggesting that the child raised by a married biological mother and father does better on more or less every measurable outcome as compared to the single parent, the divorce and remarriage, the cohabitating, and just the divorce relationship. So then that raises the question, well, what about the same-sex parenting? And I didn't address that in what I said today because actually I don't think that's the main vehicle for why the state's in the marriage business. The state's in the marriage business to try to get as many men and women to commit to each other permanently and exclusively as possible so that as many children as possible are raised by their married mother and father. And that's why we have marriage as the public policy institution that we do, and that's why redefining marriage would undercut from that public policy purpose. It would undercut it in the three ways that I suggested, that it would send a signal that men and women are interchangeable, and that you don't have an institution that teaches that fathers are essential. It'll undercut it by further and future redefinitions of marriage, and it'll undercut it by directly challenging the religious liberty of organizations like adoption agencies that try to find homes for orphans with married moms and dads. But then there's the next question. What do we know about the social science for same-sex parenting? And here I'll just say there have been lots of studies that have been conducted, frequently using small, what's known as convenience samples, in which the sample is somewhat biased because it's not large, random, or representative. You can draw exactly no conclusion about a population as a whole from a sample that's not representative of that population as a whole, which is why you need large, representative, random sampling. Many of the studies that we have, the most average respondent that's being sampled is a double income, educated, upper middle class lesbian couple living in Manhattan or San Francisco. And so from that sample, it's very hard to conclude something about the population as a whole, because that sample isn't particularly representative. We've had 3 studies now, to my knowledge, that have used large random representative studies, 1 in Canada and then 2 in the United States. 2 of those studies have come back more or less consistent with the prior studies. One of those studies has been contested. It came out saying there was no differences, and then some scholars looked back at that and said, actually, you're controlling for the variable in which the difference is occurring. So for my general take is that the verdict is still out on this, but we have good reason to think that the verdict will come back in keeping with the current rigorous social science, because the social science suggests there's 3 pathways in which marriage matters: biology, gender, and stability. So the social science that we have, 40 years of large random representative samples, show that a biological connection between the parent and the child matters. And one way in which we know this is that even infants who are adopted at birth tend to have greater challenges than infants who are raised by their biological mother and father, even when they then control in various ways for who the birth mother and the birth father were. Something about human nature is that having a biological connection between the mother and the child, between the father and the child, matters. Mothers hear their own infants cry better than they do other infants. Having a biological father actually delays the onset of puberty in girls by about a year. They don't know all the causal pathways of how this happens, but they know that biology matters. They then know that gender matters, that mothers and fathers interact with their kids in different ways. And then we know that stability matters. Being in a stable relationship matters. Each time a child goes through a transition, that's one entry point for poorer outcomes. So then what do we know about the same-sex relationship? There won't be a biological relationship between both parents and the child. There won't be gender complementary parenting by definition of a true father or true mother household in the child. And thus far, it looks like it won't be a particularly stable environment. Not because of homosexuality, but because of the gender pairings. What we know is that women tend to initiate most of the divorce proceedings. About 2/3 of divorces are filed by women, largely because women have a much higher expectation for emotional satisfaction than men. And so on a college campus, you could ask yourself this question: how often do you hear from your male friends, "Oh, I broke up with her, my emotional needs weren't being met"? That's not a typical male reason for getting out of the relationship. So it's counterintuitive because women tend to be more relational than men, but lesbians have the shortest lived relationship of all 3 types: same-sex male, same-sex female, and opposite-sex relationships. Not because of anything to do with homosexuality. It just has to do with the gender pairings of the relationship. Same-sex marriage relationships tend to be more open. That's where you get the monogamish phenomenon that the New York Times discussed. So that's why when I think the social science comes back, when we've had a couple of decades of rigorous social science, I think it will be in keeping with the existing social science, that married biological mother and father will perform best for children because of the biology, because of the gender, and because of the stability.
Yeah, I'd like to say something as a birth mother, an adoptive mother, and a former foster mother, which is that kids want their parents. And no matter what the parents have done, kids want their parents. It's just quite an amazing reality. And I think, regardless of the social science issue, whatever the social science says or doesn't say, I think we're asking the wrong question in a certain way. This is kind of a technocratic way of answering a question, which is, in a sense, deeply a moral question. And the moral question is, what is owed to the child? What is owed to the child? And I think what is owed to the child is for him to know his origins and to be raised and cared for by both of the people who brought him into being. And if that can't happen for some unavoidable reason, then you have a backup plan, adoption, foster care. Those are backup plans. But just because a person desperately wants a child, whether it's, I went through 4 years of infertility. I desperately wanted a child. But that doesn't confer upon me a right to have a child, right? And so I think the issue that the parenting studies are looking at, see, that baby agrees with me. That's good. I hear from the peanut gallery over there. The parenting studies, and I think people are reading something into that isn't quite there. The issue isn't, do you have good parenting skills? Do you as a mother, do you as a father, do you as a lesbian, do you as a gay man, do you have good parenting skills? Some of the studies are conducted in that way. In other words, they'll look at parenting behaviors and count them up, and see how many people, how often do they provide comfort, and how often do they, how do they talk to the child, and so on and so forth. There's parenting behaviors. But that isn't the whole story, right? It's not a matter of a person's parenting skills. You may be a very good parent. You may be a very loving person. There may be absolutely nothing wrong with you as a divorced and remarried person, for example, okay? But there is a structural injustice to the child built into the situation that can be very difficult to overcome, as many step families know. I know a lot of step families make it work, but the ones that make it work are aware of how much work it is to make it work. There are a lot of places where it can go wrong because you've got a structural issue that you have to deal with. And so I don't disagree with what Ryan's talking about here, but I think there's another issue that needs to go on the table, which is that the social science studies are only getting at a part of the thing that I think really matters. They're just, I use the term structural injustice to distinguish it from the idea that the parents may be good parents, there may be nothing wrong with them, but the child is in a situation which has a problem built into it from the beginning, and the best parenting in the world may not be enough to overcome it. And we already know that. That's, I think, what the social science data is kind of telling us,
We'll open up the floor at this point too.
Brandon, welcome class to 75. In this soundbite culture of ours, how can we get to a deeper conversation which is so sorely needed in this
country? So the question was, in this soundbite culture, how can we get to a deeper conversation? I think that really the only way that can happen is learning to cultivate friendships with people that we disagree with. So, for example, several of us have interacted with John Corvino, who is the author of a number of books arguing for gay rights generally and same-sex marriage specifically. I think a number of us are acknowledged in some of those books for the feedback that we gave, but was not always heeded. But, I've had a lot of conversations with John, and away from the public eye and the sort of immediacy of the fight, you can start to get a little bit deeper, and you can start to understand where the other person is coming from, what are the things that are important to them. And I don't want to pretend that you can solve those problems and come to consensus, but you can at least get a much deeper conversation. I've also, Justin Lee is the founder of an organization called the Gay Christian Network, which is a predominantly evangelical organization, and most of the members of it affirm same-sex marriage. He and I have gone out on a number of occasions to universities to talk about how do we try to address these questions. We'll actually be at Pepperdine next weekend doing this. And there, one of the things that I think has been very helpful about conversations with Justin has been just learning to find common language, that we figure out ways that words are being used differently, and then begin to try to explain how those words are being used differently. It's not an easy task, and especially on this issue, the connotations that words will have to different audiences. For example, when I used the word gay earlier in my talk, it probably bothered some people in the room. And I chose that because at that point I was primarily concerned with speaking to those who disagree with the church's teaching. And I was trying to use language that would connect with them as directly as possible, even though it's language that will be problematic to other audiences. So this, I think the two things that I would emphasize are the importance of developing friendships that are deep enough that you can actually get into issues of disagreement with people who disagree with you. And then to learn how to understand the way that language is being used differently and start to work towards clarifying that so that you know how to speak to different audiences. Does anyone else want to?
James, I'm in the law school. I just have a quick question. You guys bring up a whole bunch of social policy issues and the social science issues. I was just wondering, specifically in regards to equal protection and due process claims, how can a legal argument be framed in regards to this?
I haven't finished law school, but and it's only Yale Law School. Unfortunately, we don't learn the law there. But we do talk a lot about. We actually do talk a lot about equal protection. So I think it's the only law we have. I think there are a couple ways to go. I mean, there are lots of different doctrines that develop in the court's jurisprudence, especially over the last few decades, to try to implement the Equal Protection Clause, to try to apply it to particular cases. But all of them are variations on a theme of arbitrariness, right? It's arbitrariness plus something, right? It's not a good enough reason for the cost that the policy is supposed to have to enact it. So at bottom, the argument against the equal protection argument is the argument for conjugal marriage. It's the policy argument for it. Two quick follow-ups on that. So the first thing is that it's not a, I agree with Justice Alito's dissent in Windsor as well for the excellent reason that he cites us. Yeah. So, I mean, there he tries to put it out in as simple and austere and unelaborate terms as possible, that if this were simply a matter of equality, it would be a matter of expanding or restricting access to the one same thing. But really the debate is about which of two substantive and controversial and differently founded visions of marriage to be enshrining in the first place. It's not like the interracial marriage debate in that respect. And then the second thing is to note that every aspect of the common good that ever justifies state action, everything that's contained in the idea of a state interest, an important interest, substantial interest, compelling interest, pick your formulation, is in some way at stake in this debate, as Ryan's discussion shows. The last thing is that almost every case that strikes down DOMA, that struck down DOMA before Windsor, all the federal cases, or that purport to strike that, to find a constitutional problem with a state marriage law, go through a key step. The key step is to say, whatever you think the basis for recognizing opposite-sex relationships is, it couldn't possibly be affected, positively or negatively, by what happens over here with same-sex couples. They're just assuming, again, on one of the very things at stake, which is this really just a matter of expanding access, or is it going to change the social meaning of marriage law in a way that does affect every one of the interests that marriage law serves? Marriage law doesn't serve all of these interests by the magic of the word marriage. It's not something about the spelling or the sound, the phonemes. It's something about the idea behind marriage that the law promotes. And one way the law promotes ideas about marriage is by its eligibility requirements, and changing those is what changes the culture in ways that undermine the point of marriage law. As soon as you're in those thickets, the idea that you can make a straight line from equal protection to requiring same-sex marriage, which is recognition of any two adults, but only if they're in a sexual relationship, and only if they're unrelated, and only if they have a certain kind of promise, but just two, it just starts to look ridiculous.
I'm not a lawyer, so that you should listen to him. But I would have a simpler response to that. It might not have any purchase in a court of law at all, but it kind of works for me, which is that if this debate is all about creating equality, why are we creating a social institution that is now going to introduce new forms of inequality? Why is it that most children have a legally recognized right to know both of their parents, and now some children will not have that legally recognized right? As a matter of fact, the government will stand between them and knowing one of their parents. Isn't that a kind of inequality, and what justifies that form of inequality? It's a kind of argument by analogy, I suppose you could say, but nobody's bringing up this fact. Isn't there a kind of inequality that takes place when a mother decides that now that her baby is born, she's not so keen on sharing the parenting of that child with another woman? She thought she was going to be okay with it, but when the baby's born, it doesn't feel the way she thought it was going to feel. We allow, if a woman wants to put a baby up for adoption, we let her change her mind. We give her, 2 weeks or something, depending on the jurisdiction. We let people change their minds after the baby's born to say, I want the baby, But a woman who's in a same-sex relationship is committing when she says I do to the other woman, she is committing in advance to share the parenting of any children that she has with that other woman in advance of the baby ever being born. And so and I think anyone who's a mother, fellas, I don't know if you'll get this, but anybody who's been a mother, even if you really like the other woman, she's your sister or your mom or whatever, it just doesn't feel the same. Having your child call somebody else mom, you're not ready for how that's going to feel, right? And I've read a lot of lesbian custody cases. That's why I kind of, have tuned into this. That they break up at some point, usually within, a lot of times like right around the time the kid's 2 years old, they're breaking up. And I'm guessing, I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing that there is an aspect of that experience that you can't fully predict. And we recognize that. The law recognizes that with adoptive moms. Why doesn't it recognize it with moms in this kind of situation? So it's like we've assumed from the beginning that those cases will never come up, and if they do come up, we're going to just, they don't count. Somehow they don't count. And I don't think that's right.
We've got time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Chris Harrington. I'm an 08 alumnus. Ryan, this one's for you. You talked a little bit about the state interest of marriage. I was curious how you would reply to the objection that the state has significant interest financially in terms of divorce law and
Sure. Well, actually, say more. In what sense do you mean that?
You said
I mean,
that the state's primary interest is in having the next generation of children raised, but I've heard a lot of people make the argument that the state has a significant interest in tax issues,
Sure.
divorce law,
Right.
inheritance, that
Gotcha.
kind of thing. So they have a lot of other
Yep. So the question is, I framed my argument saying that the state's interest was largely in ensuring that children are conceived and raised inside of a relationship with their mother and father. And the question was, well, what about also about economic questions, taxes, inheritance, things like that? And the first response would be, I think all of those follow from that primary interest. So the way that we might structure our tax system, the way that we might structure the inheritance laws, the way that we might have various economic effects of how we regulate marriage are largely about incentivizing that man and that woman to stick together for the rest of their lifetime. And it's about treating them as a unit in the eyes of the law, but also treating them as a unit in the eyes of economics. So you might have various benefit schemes where your spouse is put on your health care, put on your health insurance. Your spouse is your automatic co-heir if you pass away, gets your retirement benefits, gets your unemployment benefits if you lose your job, that sort of thing. It seems to me, though, that once you get rid of the primary purpose being about ensuring a stable relationship in which any children that are entered into will have access to relationship with that man and that woman, what would be the purpose of regulating marriage if it was just for these economic benefits, but only understood as a permanent monogamous, sexually exclusive relationship? Now we're back into Sharif's point that it seems utterly arbitrary if marriage is just about intense emotional regard for the sake of economic benefits, that we're only going to structure it so that monogamous, exclusive, permanent unions get this sort of economic treatment. Now we're in the world of thruples and wed leases and monogamous relationships. Now we're just in the world of contract law. And it would more or less be that consenting adults should form whatever sorts of relationships of whatever size or shape consenting adults want to come in, and then they can contract for various tax purposes or inheritance purposes or co-ownership purposes. And what you've done is you more or less abolished marriage as a distinct legal and social and cultural category, and you replaced it with contract law.
That's all we have time for tonight. I hope that you'll carry on this discussion this evening. You should please join me once again in thanking our speakers on behalf of Professor Munoz, the Tocqueville program, the Irish Rover, and all of our sponsors.